Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flying podcast. Today is episode 3 of my reading of H P Lovecraft's supernatural horror in literature. We will begin where we left off at part 8, The Weird Tradition in America. Okay, here we go. The public for whom Poe wrote, though grossly unappreciative of his art, was by no means unaccustomed to the horrors with which he dealt. America, besides inheriting the usual dark folklore of Europe, had an additional fund of weird associations to draw upon, so that spectral legends had already been recognized as a fruitful subject matter for literature. Charles Brockden Brown had achieved phenomenal fame with his Radcliffean romances, and Washington Irving's lighter treatment of eerie themes had quickly become classic. The additional fund proceeded, as Paul Elmer Moore has pointed out, from the keen spiritual and theological interests of the first colonists, plus the strange and forbidding nature of the scene in which they were plunged. The vast and gloomy virgin forests in whose perpetual twilight all terrors might well lurk. The hordes of coppery Indians whose strange saturnine visages and violent customs hinted strongly at traces of infernal origin. The free rein given under the influence of Puritan theocracy to all manner of notions respecting man's relation to the stern and vengeful God of the Calvinists, and to the sulphurous adversary of that God about whom so much was thundered in the pulpits each Sunday, and the morbid introspection developed by an isolated backwoods life devoid of normal amusements, and of the recreational mood harassed by commands for theological self-examination, keyed to unnatural emotional repression, and forming, above all, a mere grim struggle for survival. All these things conspired to produce an environment in which the black whisperings of sinister grandames were heard far beyond the chimney corner, and in which tales of witchcraft and unbelievable secret monstrosities lingered long after the dread days of the Salem nightmare. Poe represents the newer, more disillusioned, and more technically finished of the weird schools that arose out of this propitious milieu. Another school, the tradition of moral values, gentle restraint, and mild leisurely fantasy tinged more or less with the whimsical, was represented by another famous, misunderstood, and lonely figure in American letters, the shy and sensitive Nathaniel Hawthorne, scion of antique Salem and great-grandson of one of the bloodiest of the old witchcraft judges. In Hawthorne, we have none of the violence, the daring, the high coloring, the intense dramatic sense, the cosmic malignity, and the undivided and impersonal artistry of Poe. Here instead is a gentle soul cramped by the Puritanism of early New England, shadowed and wistful, and grieved at an unmoral universe which everywhere transcends the conventional patterns thought by our forefathers to represent divine and immutable law. Evil, a very real force to Hawthorne, appears on every hand as a lurking and conquering adversary, and the visible world becomes, in his fancy, a theater of infinite tragedy and woe, with unseen, half-existent influences hovering over it and through it, battling for supremacy and molding the destinies of the hapless mortals who form its vain and self-deluded population. The heritage of American weirdness was his to a most intense degree, and he saw a dismal throng of vague specters behind the common phenomena of life, but he was not disinterested enough to value impressions, sensations, and beauties of narrative for their own sake. He must needs weave his fantasy into some quietly melancholy fabric of didactic or allegorical cast, in which his meekly resigned cynicism may display with naive moral appraisal the perfidy of a human race which he cannot cease to cherish and mourn despite his insight into its hypocrisy. Supernatural horror, then, is never a primary object with Hawthorne, though its impulses were so deeply woven into his personality that he cannot help suggesting it with the force of genius when he calls upon the unreal world to illustrate the pensive sermon he wishes to preach. Hawthorne's intimations of the weird, always gentle, elusive, and restrained may be traced throughout his work. The mood that produced them found one delightful vent and the Teutonized retelling of classical myths for children contained in a Wonder Book and Tanglewood Tales, and at other times exercised itself in casting a certain strangeness and intangible witchery or malevolence over events not meant to be actually supernatural, as in the macabre posthumous novel Dr. Grimshaw's Secret, which invests with peculiar sort of repulsion a house existing to this day in Salem and abutting on the ancient Charter Street burying ground, and the marble faun, whose design was sketched out in an Italian villa reputed to be haunted. A tremendous background of genuine fantasy and mystery palpitates just beyond the common reader's sight, and glimpses of fabulous blood in mortal veins are hinted at during the course of a romance which cannot help being interesting despite the persistent incubus of moral allegory, anti-popery propaganda, and a Puritan putery which has caused the late D.H. Lawrence to express a longing to treat the author in a highly undignified manner. Septimus Felton, a posthumous novel whose idea was to have been elaborated and incorporated into the unfinished dull of a romance, touches on the elixir of life in a more or less capable fashion, whilst the notes for a never-written tale to be called The Ancestral Footstep shew what Hawthorne could have done with an intensive treatment of an old English superstition, that of an ancient and accursed line whose members left footprints of blood as they walked, which appears incidentally in both Septimus Felton and Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. Many of Hawthorne's shorter tales exhibit weirdness, either of atmosphere or of incident, to a remarkable degree. Edward Randolph's portrait in Legends of the Province House has its diabolic moments. The Minister's Black Veil, founded on an actual incident, and the ambitious guest imply much more than they state, whilst Ethan Brand, a fragment of a longer work never completed, raises to genuine heights of cosmic fear with its vignette of the wild hill country and the blazing, desolate lime kilns, and its delineation of the bionic, unpardonable sinner, whose troubled life ends with a peal of laughter in the night as he seeks rest amid the flames of the furnace. Some of Hawthorne's notes tell of weird tales as he would have written had he lived longer, an especially vivid plot being that concerning a baffling stranger who appeared now and then in public assemblies, and who was at last followed and found to come and go from a very ancient grave. But foremost, as a finished artistic unit among all our author's weird material, is the famous and exquisitely wrought novel The House of the Seven Gables, in which the relentless working out of an ancestral curse is developed with astonishing power against the sinister background of a very ancient Salem house. One of these peaked Gothic affairs which formed the first regular buildup of our New England coastal towns, but which gave way after the 17th century to the more familiar gambrel roofed or classic Georgian types known as colonial. Of these old gambled Gothic houses, scarcely a dozen are to be seen today in their original condition throughout the United States. But one well-known to Hawthorne readers still stands in Turner Street, Salem, and is pointed out with a doubtful artistry as the scene and inspiration of the romance. Such an edifice with its spectral peaks, its clustered chimneys, its overhanging second story, its grotesque corner brackets, and its diamond-paned lattice windows is indeed an object well calculated to evoke somber reflections, typifying as it does the dark Puritan age of concealed horror and witch whispers, which preceded the beauty, rationality, and spaciousness of the 18th century. Hawthorne saw many in his youth, and he knew the black tales connected with some of them. He heard too many rumors of a curse upon his own line as the result of his great-grandfather's severity as a witchcraft judge in 1692. From this setting came the immortal tale, New England's greatest contribution to weird literature, and we can feel in an instant the authenticity of the atmosphere presented to us. Stealthy horror and disease lurk within the weather-blackened, moss-crusted, and elm-shadowed walls of the archaic dwelling so vividly displayed, and we grasp the brooding malignity of the place when we read that its builder, old Colonel Pyncheon, snatched the land with particular ruthlessness from its original settler, Matthew Mowle, whom he condemned to the gallows as a wizard in the year of the panic. Mowle died cursing old Pyncheon, God will give me blood to drink, and the waters of the old well on the sea's land turned bitter. Mowle's carpenter's son consented to build the great gabled house for his father's triumphant enemy, but the old colonel died strangely on the day of its dedication. Then follow generations of odd vicissitudes, with queer whispers in the dark power of the malls, and particular and sometimes terrible ends befalling the Pincians. The overshadowing malevolence of the ancient house, almost as alive as Poe's House of Usher, though in a subtler way, pervades the tale as a recurrent motif pervades an operatic tragedy. And when the main story is reached, we behold the modern Pincians in a pitiable state of decay. Poor old Hepzibah, the eccentric reduced gentlewoman, childlike and fortunate Clifford, just released from undeserved imprisonment, sly and treacherous Judge Pincian, who is the old colonel all over again. And all these figures are tremendous symbols and are well matched by the stunted vegetation and anemic fowls in the garden. It was almost a pity to supply a fairly happy ending with a union of sprightly Phoebe, cousin and last scion of the Pincians, to the presupposing young man who turned out to be the last of the Mauls. This union presumably ends the curse. Hawthorne avoids all violence of diction or movement and keeps his implications of terror well in the background. But occasional glimpses amply serve to sustain the mood and redeem the work from pure allegorical aridity. Incidents like the bewitching of Alice Pincian in the early 18th century and the spectral music of her harpsichord which precedes the death in the family, the latter a variant of an immemorial type of Aryan myth, link the action directly with the supernatural, whilst the dead nocturnal vigil of old Judge Pincian in the ancient parlor with his frightfully ticking watch is stark horror of the most poignant and genuine sort. The way in which the judge's death is first adumbrated by the motions and sniffing of a strange cat outside the window long before the fact is suspected, either by the reader or by any of the characters, is a stroke of genius which Poe could not have surpassed. Later, the strange cat watches intently outside that same window in the night and on the next day for something. It is clearly the psychopomp of primeval myth, fitted and adapted with infinite deftness to this latter-day setting. But Hawthorne left no well-defined literary posterity. His mood and attitude belong to the age which closed with him, and it is the spirit of Poe who so clearly and realistically understood the natural basis of the horror appeal and the correct mechanics of its achievement, which survived and blossomed. Among the earliest of Poe's disciples may be reckoned the brilliant young Irishman Fitzjames O'Brien, 1828 to 1862, who became naturalized as an American and perished honorably in the Civil War. It is he who gave us What Was It, the first well-shaped short story of a tangible but invisible being, and the portrait of de Maupassant's Horla. He also created the inimitable diamond lens, in which a young micropist falls in love with a maiden of an infinitesimal world, which he has discovered in a drop of water. O'Brien's early death undoubtedly deprived us of some masterful tales of strangeness and terror, though his genius was not, properly speaking, of the same Titan quality which characterized Poe and Hawthorne. Closer to the greatness was the eccentric and saturnine journalist Ambrose Bierce, born in 1842, who likewise entered the Civil War, but survived to write some immortal tales and to disappear in 1913 in as great a cloud of mystery as any he ever evoked from his nightmare fancy. Bierce was a satirist and a pamphleteer of note, but the bulk of his artistic reputation must rest upon his grim and savage short stories, a large number of which deal with the Civil War and form the most vivid and realistic expression which that conflict has yet received in fiction. Virtually all of Bierce's tales are tales of horror, and whilst many of them treat only of physical and psychological horrors within nature, a substantial portion admit the malignity, supernatural, and form a leading element in America's fund of weird literature. Mr. Samuel Loveman, a living poet and critic who was personally acquainted with Bierce, thus sums up the genius of the great shadow maker in the preface to some of his letters. In Bierce, the evocation of horror becomes for the first time not so much the prescription or perversion of Poe and Maupassant, but an atmosphere definite and uncannily precise. Words so simple that one would be prone to ascribe them to the limitations of a literary hack take on an unholy horror, a new and unguessed transformation. In Poe, one finds it a tour de force, and Maupassant a nervous engagement of the flagellated climax. To Bierce, simply and sincerely, diabolism held in its tormented death a legitimate and reliant means to the end. Yet a tacit confirmation with nature is in every instance insisted upon. In the death of Halpin Fraser, flowers, verdure, and the boughs and leaves of trees are magnificently placed as an opposing foil to unnatural malignity. Not the accustomed golden world, but a world pervaded with mystery of blue and the breathless recalcitrance of dreams is Bierce's. Yet, curiously, inhumanity is not altogether absent. The inhumanity mentioned by Mr. Loveman finds vent in a rare strain of sardonic comedy, in graveyard humor, and a kind of delight in images of cruelty and tantalizing disappointment. The former quality is well illustrated by some of the subtitles in the darker narrative, such as "One does not always eat what is on the table," describing a body laid out for a coroner's inquest, and "A man, though naked, may be in rags," referring to a frightfully mangled corpse. Bierce's work is in general somewhat uneven. Many of the stories are obviously mechanical and marred by a jaunty and commonplace artificial style derived from journalistic models, but the grim malevolence stalking through all of them is unmistakable. And several stand out as a permanent mountain peaks of American weird writing. The death of Halpin Fraser, called by Frederick Tabor Cooper the most fiendishly ghastly tale in the literature of the Anglo-Saxon race, tells of a body skulking by night without a soul in a weird and horribly ensanguined wood, and of a man beset by ancestral memories who met death at the claws of that which had been his fervently loved mother. The Damned Thing, frequently copied in popular anthologies, chronicles the hideous devastations of an invisible entity that waddles and flounders on the hills in the wheat fields by night and day. The Suitable Surroundings evokes with singular subtlety yet apparent simplicity a piercing sense of the terror which may reside in the written word. In the story, the weird author, Colston, says to his friend Marsh, "You are brave enough to read me in a streetcar, but in a deserted house alone in the forest at night, bah. I have a manuscript in my pocket that would kill you." Marsh reads the manuscript in the Suitable Surroundings, and it does kill him. The middle toe of the right foot is clumsily developed, but has a powerful climax. A man named Manton has horribly killed his 2 children and his wife, the latter of whom lacked the middle toe of the right foot. 10 years later, he returns much altered to the neighborhood, and being secretly recognized, is provoked into a Bowie knife duel in the dark, to be held in the now abandoned house where his crime was committed. When the moment of the duel arrives, a trick is played upon him, and he is left without an antagonist, shut in a night black ground floor room of reputedly haunted edifice, with the thick dust of a decade on every hand. No knife is drawn against him, for only through a scare is intended, but on the next day he is found crouched in a corner with a distorted face, dead of sheer fright at something he has seen. The only clue visible to the discoverers is one having terrible implications. In the dust of years that lay thick upon the floor, leading from the door by which they had entered, straight across the room to within a yard of Manton's crouching corpse, were 3 parallel lines of footprints, light but definite impressions of bare feet. The outer ones, those of the small children, the inner, a woman's. From the point at which they ended, they did not return. They pointed out all one way. And of course, the woman's print showed a lack of the middle toe on the right foot. The Spook House, told with a severely homely air of journalistic verisimilitude, conveys terrible hints of the shocking mystery. In 1858, an entire family of 7 persons disappears suddenly and unaccountably from a plantation house in eastern Kentucky, leaving all its possessions untouched: furniture, clothing, food, supplies, horses, cattle, and slaves. About a year later, 2 men of high standing are forced by a storm to take shelter in the deserted dwelling, and in so doing stumble into a strange subterranean room lit by an unaccountable greenish light, and having an iron door which cannot be opened from within. In this room lie the decayed corpses of all the missing family, and as one of the discoverers rushes forward to embrace a body he seems to recognize, the other is so overpowered by a strange fetor that he accidentally shuts his companion in the vault and loses consciousness. Recovering his senses 6 weeks later, the survivor is unable to find the hidden room, and the house is burned during the Civil War. The imprisoned discoverer is never seen or heard of again. Bierce seldom realizes the atmospheric possibilities of his themes as vividly as Poe, and much of his work contains a certain touch of naivete, prosaic angularity, or early American provincialism, which contrasts somewhat with the efforts of later horror masters. Nevertheless, the genuineness and artistry of his dark intimations are always unmistakable, so that his greatness is in no danger of eclipse. As arranged in his definitively collected works, Bierce's weird tales occur mainly in two volumes. Can Such Things Be? And In the Midst of Life. The former, indeed, is almost wholly given over to the supernatural. Most of the best in American horror literature has come from pens not mainly devoted to that medium. Oliver Wendell Holmes' historic Elsie Venner suggests with admirable restraint and a natural Ophidian element in a young woman prenatally influenced, and sustains the atmosphere with finely discriminating landscape touches. In The Turn of the Screw, Henry James triumphs over his inevitable pomposity and prolixity sufficiently well to create a truly potent air of sinister menace, depicting the hideous influence of two dead and evil servants, Peter Quint and the governess Miss Giselle, over a small boy and girl who had been under their care. James was perhaps too diffuse, too unctuously urbane, and too much addicted to subtleties of speech to realize fully all the weird and devastating horror in his situations. But for all that, there was a rare and mounting tide of fright, culminating in the death of the little boy, which gives the novelette a permanent place in its special class. F. Marion Crawford produces several weird tales of varying quality, now collected in a volume entitled Wandering Ghosts. For The Blood is the Life touches powerfully on a case of moon-cursed vampirism near an ancient tower on the rocks of the lonely South Italian seacoast. The Dead Smile treats of family horrors in an old house in an ancient vault in Ireland. It introduces the banshee with considerable force. The Upper Berth is, however, Crawford's weird masterpiece and is one of the most tremendous horror stories in all literature. In this tale of a suicide-haunted stateroom, such things as the spectral saltwater dampness, the strangely open porthole, and the nightmare struggle with the nameless object are handled with incomparable dexterity. Very genuine, though not without the typical mannered extravagance of the 1890s, is the strain of horror in the early work of Robert W. Chambers. Since renowned for products of a very different quality, The King in Yellow, a series of vaguely connected short stories, having as a background a mysterious and suppressed book whose pursual brings fright, madness, and spectral tragedy, really achieves notable heights of cosmic fear in spite of uneven interest in a somewhat trivial and affected cultivation of the Gallic studio atmosphere made popular by Du Maurier's Trilby. The most powerful of its tales, perhaps, is The Yellow Sign, in which it is introduced a silent and terrible churchyard watchman with a face like a puffy graveworm's. A boy describing a tussle he has had with this creature shivers and sickens as he relates a certain detail. Well, sir, it's God's truth that when it him and grabbed me wrist, sir, when I twisted his soft, mushy fist, one of its fingers come off in me, and an artist who, after seeing him, was shared with another strange dream of a nocturnal hearse, is shocked by the voice with which the watchman accosts him. The fellow emits a muttering sound that fills the head like thick, oily smoke from a fat-rendering vat, or an odor of noisome decay. What he mumbles is merely this: "Have you found the yellow sign?" A weirdly hieroglyphed onyx talisman picked up in the street by the shearer of his dream is shortly given the artist, and after stumbling queerly upon the hellish and forbidden books of horrors, the two learn, among other hideous things which no sane mortal should know, that this talisman is indeed the nameless yellow sign handed down from the accursed cult of Hastur, from primordial Carcosa, whereof the volume treats, and some nightmare memory of which seems to lurk latent and ominous at the back of all men's minds. Soon they hear the rumbling of the black-plumed hearse, driven by the flabby and corpse-faced watchman. He enters the night-shrouded house in quest of the yellow sign, all bolts and bars rotting at his touch. And when the people rush in, drawn by a scream that no human throat could utter, they find three forms on the floor, two dead and one dying. One of the shapes is far gone in decay. It is the churchyard watchman, and the doctor exclaims, "That man must have been dead for months." It is worth observing that the author derives most of the names and allusions connected with his eldritch land of primal memory from the tales of Ambrose Bierce. Other early works of Mr. Chambers display the outre and macabre elements of the Maker of Moons and In Search of the Unknown. One cannot help regretting that he did not further develop a vein in which he could so easily have become a recognized master. Horror material of authentic force may be found in the work of the New England realist Mary E. Wilkins, whose volumes of short tales, The Wind and the Rosebush, contain a number of noteworthy achievements. In The Shadows on the Wall, we are shown with consummate skill the response of a staid New England household to uncanny tragedy. And The Sourceless Shadow of the Poisoned Brother Well prepares us for the climactic moment when the shadow of the secret murderer who has killed himself in a neighboring city suddenly appears beside it. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in The Yellow Wallpaper, raises to a classic level in subtlety, delineating the madness which crawls over a woman dwelling in the hideous papered room where a mad woman was once confined. In The Dead Valley, the eminent architect and medievalist Ralph Adams Cram achieves a memorable, potent degree of vague regional horror through subtleties of atmosphere and description. Still further, carrying on our spectral tradition, is the gifted and versatile humorist Irving S. Cobb, whose work, both early and recent, contains some finely weird specimens. Fish Head, an early achievement, is banefully effective in its portrayal of unnatural affinities between a hybrid idiot and the strange fish of an isolated lake, which at the last avenge their biped kinsman's murder. Later work of Mr. Cobb introduces an element of possible science, as in the tale of Hereditary Memory, where a modern man with a Negroid strain utters certain words in an African jungle speech when run down by a train under visual and oral circumstances, recalling the maiming of his black ancestor by a rhinoceros a century before. Extremely high in an artistic stature is the novel The Dark Chamber, 1927, by the late Leonard Klein. This is the tale of a man who, with characteristic ambition of the Gothic or Byronic hero villain, seeks to defy nature and recapture every moment of the past life through the abnormal stimulation of memory. To this end, he employs endless notes, records, mnemonic objects, and pictures, and finally odors, music, and exotic drugs. At last, his ambition goes beyond his personal life and reaches toward the black abysses of hereditary memory, even back to pre-human days amidst the steaming swamps of the Carboniferous age, into the still more unimagined depths of primal time and entity. He calls for madder music and takes stronger drugs, and finally his great dog grows oddly afraid of him. A noxious animal stench encompasses him, and he grows vacant-faced and subhuman. In the end, he takes to the woods, howling at night beneath windows. He is finally found in a thicket, mangled to death. Beside him is the mangled corpse of his dog. They have killed each other. The atmosphere of this novel is malevolently potent, much attention being paid to the central figure's sinister home and household. A less subtle and well-balanced, but nevertheless a highly effective creation is Herbert S. Gorman's novel, The Place Called Dagon, which relates the dark history of a western Massachusetts backwater where the decadence of refugees from the Salem witchcraft still keep alive the morbid and degraded horrors of the Black Sabbath. Sinister House by Leland Hall has touches of magnificent atmosphere but is marred by a somewhat mediocre romanticism. Very notable in their way are some of the weird conceptions of the novelist and short story writer Edward Lucas White, most of whose themes arise from actual dreams. The Song of the Sirens has a very pervasive strangeness, while such things as Locundo and the Snout rouse darker apprehensions. Mr. White imparts a very peculiar quality to his tales, an oblique sort of glamour which has its distinctive type of convincingness. Of younger Americans, none strikes the note of cosmic horror so well as the Californian poet, artist, and fictionalist Clark Ashton Smith, whose bizarre writings, drawings, paintings, and stories are the delight of a sensitive few. Mr. Smith has for his background a universe of remote and paralyzing fright, jungles of poisonous and iridescent blossoms on the moon of Saturn, evil and grotesque temples in Atlantis, Lemuria and forgotten elder worlds, and dank morasses of spotted death fungi in spectral countries beyond Earth's rim. His longest and most ambitious poem, The Hashish Eater, is in permanent and pentameter blank verse and opens up chaotic, incredible vistas of kaleidoscopic nightmare in the spaces between the stars. In sheer demoniac strangeness and fertility of conception, Mr. Smith is perhaps unexcelled by any other writer, dead or living. Who else has seen such gorgeous, luxuriant, and feverishly distorted visions of infinite spheres and multiple dimensions and lived to tell the tale? His short stories deal powerfully with other galaxies, worlds, and dimensions, as well as with strange regions and aeons on the Earth. He tells of primal Hyperborea and its black amorphous god, Sathagua, of the Last Continent Zothique and of the fabulous vampire cursed land of Avrogne in medieval France. Some of Mr. Smith's best work can be found in the brochure entitled The Double Shadow and Other Fantasies, 1933. 9. The Weird Tradition in the British Isles. Recent British literature, besides including the 3 or 4 greatest fantasticities of the present age, has been gratifyingly fertile in the element of the weird. Rudyard Kipling has often approached it, and has, despite the omnipresent mannerisms, handled it with indubitable mastery in such tales as The Phantom Rickshaw, The Finest Story in the World, The Recrudescence of Imre, and The Mark of the Beast. This latter is of particular poignancy. The picture of the naked leper priest who mewed like an otter, of the spots which appear on the chest of the man the priest cursed, of the growing carnivorousness of the victim, and of the fear which horses begin to display toward him, and of the eventually half-accomplished transformation of that victim into a leopard, being things which no reader is ever likely to forget. The final defeat of the malignant sorcery does not impair the force of the tale or the validity of its mystery. Lafcadio Hearn, strange, wandering, and exotic, departs still further from the realm of the real, and with the supreme artistry of a sensitive poet weaves fantasies impossible to an author of the solid roast beef type. His Fantastics, written in America, contains some of the most impressive ghoulishness in all literature, whilst his Quaidon, written in Japan, crystallizes with matchless skill and delicacy the eerie lore and whispered legends of that richly colorful nation. Still more of Hearn's weird wizardry of language is shewn in some of his transformations from the French, especially from Gautier and Flaubert. His versions of the latter's Temptation of St. Anthony is a classic of fevered and riotous imagery clad in the magic of singing words. Oscar Wilde might likewise be given a place amongst weird writers, both for a certain of his exquisite fairy tales and for his vivid picture of Dorian Gray, in which a marvelous portrait for years assumes the duty of aging and coarsening instead of its original, who meanwhile plunges into every excess of vice and crime without the outward loss of youth, beauty, and freshness. There is a sudden and potent climax when Dorian Gray at last becomes a murderer, seeks to destroy the painting whose changes testify to his moral degeneracy. He stabs it with a knife, and a hideous cry and clash are heard, but when the servants enter, they find it in all its pristine loveliness. Lying on the floor was a dead man, in evening dress with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had examined the rings that they recognized who it was. Matthew Phipps Scheele, author of many weird, grotesque, and adventurous novels and tales, occasionally attains a high level of horrific magic. Zulucha is a notoriously hideous fragment, but is excelled by Mr. Scheele's undoubted masterpiece, The House of Sounds, floridly written in the yellow 90s and recast with more artistic restraint in the early 20th century. The story in final form deserves a place among the foremost things of its kind. It tells of a creeping horror and a menace trickling down the centuries on a subarctic island off the coast of Norway, where amidst the sweep of demon winds and the ceaseless din of devilish waves and cataracts, a vengeful dead man built a brazen tower of terror. It is vaguely like, yet infinitely unlike, Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. In the novel The Purple Cloud, Mr. Scheele describes with tremendous power a curse which came out of the Arctic to destroy mankind, and which for a time appears to have left but a single inhabitant on our planet. The sensations of this lone survivor as he realizes his position and roams through the corpse-littered and treasure-strewn cities of the world as their absolute master are delivered with a skill and artistry falling little short of actual mastery. Unfortunately, the second half of the book, with its conventionally romantic element, involves a distinct letdown. Better known than Scheele is the ingenious Bram Stoker, who created many starkly horrific conceptions in a series of novels whose poor technique sadly impairs their net effect. The Lair of the White Worm, dealing with a gigantic primitive entity that lurks in a vault beneath an ancient castle, utterly ruins a magnificent idea by a development almost infantile. The Jewel of the Seven Stars, touching on a strange Egyptian resurrection, is less crudely written. Best of all is the famous Dracula, which has become almost the standard modern exploitation of the frightful vampire myth. Count Dracula, a vampire, dwells in a horrible castle in the Carpathians. but finally migrates to England with the design of populating the country with fellow vampires. However, an Englishman fares within Dracula's stronghold of terrors, and how the dead fiend's plot for domination is at least defeated, are elements which unite to form a tale now justly assigned a permanent place in English letters. Dracula evoked many similar novels of supernatural horror, among which the best are perhaps The Beadle by Richard Marsh, Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer, Arthur Sarsfield Ward, and The Door of the Unreal by Gerald Bliss. The latter handles quite dexterously the standard werewolf superstition. Much subtler and more artistic and told with singular skill through the juxtaposed narratives of several characters is the novel Cold Harbor by Francis Brett Young, in which an ancient house of strange malignity is powerfully delineated. The mocking and well-nigh omnipotent fiend Humphrey Furnivall holds echoes of the Manfred Montoni type of early Gothic villain, but is redeemed from triteness by many clever individualities. Only the slight diffuseness of explanation at the close and the somewhat too free use of divination as a plot factor keep this tale from approaching absolute perfection. In the novel Witchwood, John Buchan depicts with tremendous force the survival of the evil Sabbat in a lonely district of Scotland. The description of the Black Forest with the evil stone and the terrible cosmic abdumbrations where the horror is finally extirpated will repay one for wading through the very gradual action and plethora of Scottish dialect. Some of Mr. Buchan's short stories are also extremely vivid in their spectral intimations. The Green Wildebeest, The Tale of African Witchcraft, The Wind in the Portico with its awakening of dead Britannia Roman horrors, and School Scary with its touches of subarctic fright being especially remarkable. Clarence Houseman and the brief novelette The Werewolf attains a high degree of gruesome tension and achieves, to some extent, the atmosphere of authentic folklore. The Elixir of Life, Arthur Ransom, attains some darkly excellent effects, despite a general naivete of plot, while H.B. Drake's The Shadowy Thing sums up strange and terrible vistas. George MacDonald's Lilith has a compelling bizarrerie of all its own, the first and simpler of the two versions being perhaps the more effective. Deserving of distinguished notice as a forceful craftsman to whom an unseen mystic world is ever a close and vital reality is the poet Walter de la Mare, whose haunting verse and exquisite prose alike bear consistent traces of a strange vision reaching deep into veiled spheres of beauty and terrible and forbidden dimensions of being. In the novel Return, we see the soul of a dead man reach out of its grave of 2 centuries and fasten itself upon the flesh of the living, so that even the face of the victim becomes that which had long ago returned to dust. Of the shorter tales of which several volumes exist, many are unforgettable for their command of fears and sorcery's darkest ramifications, notably Seaton's Ant, in which there lowers a noxious background of malignant vampirism, The Tree, which tells of a frightful vegetable growth in the yard of a starving artist, Out of the Deep, wherein we are given leave to imagine what thing answered the summons of a dying wastrel in a dark, lonely house when he pulled a long, feared bell cord in the attic chamber of his dread, haunted boyhood. A Recluse, which hints at what sent a chance gas flying from a house in the night. Mr. Kemp, which shows us a mad clerical hermit in quest of the human soul, dwelling in a frightful sea cliff region beside an archaic abandoned chapel, and All Hallows, a glimpse of a demoniac forces besieging a lonely medieval church and miraculously restoring the rotting masonry. De la Mare does not make fear the soul or even the dominant element of most of his tales, being apparently more interested in the subtleties of character involved. Occasionally he sinks to sheer whimsical fantasy on the Barry order. Still, he is among the very few to whom unreality is a vivid living presence, and as such he is able to put into his current occasional fear studies a keen potency which only a rare master can achieve. His poem, The Listeners, restores the Gothic shudder to modern verse. The weird short story who has fared well of late, an important contributor being the versatile E.F. Benson, who is The Man Who Went Too Far, breathed whisperingly of a house at the edge of a dark wood, and of Pan's hoof mark on the breast of a dead man. Mr. Benson's volume, Visible and Invisible, contains several short stories of singular power, notably Negotium Perambulans, whose unfolding reveals an abnormal monster from an ancient ecclesiastical panel which performs an act of miraculous vengeance in a lonely village on the Cornish coast, and the horror horn through which lopes a terrible half-human survival dwelling on unvisited alpine peaks. The Face, in another collection, is a lethally potent in its relentless aura of doom. H.R. Wakefield, in the collections They Return at Evening and Others Who Return, manages now and then to achieve great heights of horror despite a vitiating air of sophistication. The most notable stories are the Red Lodge, with its slimy, aqueous evil, He Cometh and He Passeth By, and He Shall Sing, the Cairn, Look Up There, Blind Man's Bluff, and that bit of lurking millennial horror, the 17th Hole at Doncaster. Mention has been made of the weird work of H.G. Wells and A. Conan Doyle. The former and the Ghost of Fear reaches a very high level, while all the items in the 30 Strange Stories have strongly fantastic implications. Doyle now and then struck a powerful spectral note, as in The Captain of the Pole Star, A Tale of Arctic Ghostliness, and Lot Number 249, wherein the reanimated mummy theme is used with more than ordinary skill. Hugh Walpole, of the same family as the founder of Gothic fiction, has sometimes approached the bizarre with much success. His short story, Miss Lunt, carries a very poignant shudder. John Metcalf, in the collection published as The Smoking Leg, attains now and then a rare pitch of potency. The tale entitled The Badlands, containing graduations of terror that strongly savor of genius. More whimsical and inclined toward the amiable and innocuous fantasy of Sir J.M. Barrie are the short tales of E.M. Forster, grouped under the title of Celestial Omnibus. Of these, only one, dealing with the glimpse of Pan and his aura of fright, may be said to hold the true element of cosmic horror. Mrs. H.D. Everett, though adhering to a very old and conventional models, occasionally reaches singular heights of spiritual terror in her collection of short stories. L.P. Hartley is notable for his incisive and extremely ghastly tale, A Visitor from Down Under. Mary Sinclair's uncanny stories contain more of traditional occultism than of that creative treatment of fear which marks mastery in the field, and are inclined to lay more stress on human emotions in psychological delving than upon the stark phenomena of cosmos utterly unreal. It may be well to remark here that occult believers are probably less effective than materialists in delineating the spectral and the fantastic, since to them the phantom world is so commonplace that reality they tend to refer to it with less awe, remoteness, and impressiveness than do those who see it in an absolute and stupendous violation of the natural order. Or of rather uneven stylistic quality, but vast occasional power in its suggestion of lurking worlds and beings behind the ordinary surface of life, is the work of William Hope Hodgson, known today far less than it deserves to be. Despite a tendency toward conventionally sentimental conceptions of the universe and the man's relation to it and its fellows, Mr. Hodgson is perhaps second only to Algernon Blackwood in his serious treatment of unreality. Few can equal him in adumbrating the nearness of nameless forces and monstrous besieging entities through causal hints and insignificant details, or in the conveying feelings of the spectral and the abnormal in connection with regions or buildings. In The Boats of the Glen Carrig, 1907, we are shown a variety of malign marvels in accursed unknown lands as encountered by the survivors of a sunken ship. The brooding menace in the earlier part of the book is impossible to surpass, though a letdown in the direction of ordinary romance and adventure occurs towards the end. An inaccurate and pseudo-romantic attempt to reproduce 18th century prose distracts from the general effort, but the really profound nautical erudition everywhere displayed is a compensating factor. The House on the Borderland, 1908. Perhaps the greatest of all Mr. Hodgson's work tells of a lonely and evilly regarded house in Ireland, which forms a focus for hideous otherworld forces and sustains a siege of blasphemous hybrid anomalies from hidden abysses below. The wanderings of the narrator's spirit through limitless light years of cosmic space and kalpas of eternity and its witness of the solar system's final destruction constitutes something almost unique in standard literature. And everywhere there is a manifest the author's power to suggest vague, ambushed horrors in natural scenery. But for a few touches of commonplace sentimentality, this book would be a classic of the first water. The Ghost Pirate, 1709. Regarded by Mr. Hodgson as rounding out a trilogy with the two previously mentioned works, is a powerful account of a doomed and haunted ship on its last voyage, and of the terrible sea devils of quasi-human aspect, and perhaps the spirit of bygone buccaneers that besiege it and finally drag it down to an unknown fate. With its command of maritime knowledge and its clever selection of hints and incidents suggestive of latent horrors in nature, this book at times reaches enviable peaks of power. The Nightland, 1912, is long extended, 583 pages, tale of the Earth's infinitely remote future, billions of years ahead, after the death of the sun. It is told in a rather clumsy fashion as the dreams of a man in the 17th century, whose mind merges with its own future incarnation, and is seriously marred by painful verboseness, repetitiousness, artificial and nauseously sticky romantic sentimentality, and an attempt at archaic language even more grotesque and absurd than that in Glen Carrig. Allowing for all its faults, this is yet one of the most potent pieces of macabre imagination ever written. The picture of a night-black, dead planet with the remains of the human race concentrated in a stupendously vast metal pyramid and besieged by monstrous hybrid and other unknown forces of the darkness is something that no reader can ever forget. Shapes and entities of an altogether not human and inconceivable sort, the prowlers of the black, man-forsaken, and unexplored world outside the pyramid, are suggested and partly described with ineffable potency, while the night-bound landscape with its chasms and slopes and dying volcanism take on an almost sentient terror beneath the author's touch. Midway in the book, the central figure ventures outside the pyramid on a quest through death-haunted realms untrod by man for millions of years, and in his slow, minutely described day-by-day progress over unthinkable leagues of immemorial blackness, there is a sense of cosmic alienage, breathless mystery, and terrified expectancy unrivaled in the whole range of literature. The last quarter of the book drags woefully but fails to spoil the tremendous power of the whole. Mr. Hodgson's later volume, Carnacki the Ghost Finder, consists of several long and short stories published many years before in magazines. In quality, it falls conspicuously below the level of other books. We find here a more or less conventional stock figure of the infallible detective type, the progeny of Mr. Dupin and Sherlock Holmes, and the close kin of Algernon Blackwood's John Silence, moving through scenes and events badly marred by an atmosphere of unprofessional occultism. A few of the episodes, however, are of undeniable power and afford glimpses of the peculiar genius characteristic of the author. Naturally, it is impossible in a brief sketch to trace out all the classic modern uses of the terror element. The ingredient must of necessity enter into a work, both prose and verse, treated broadly of life, and we are therefore not surprised to find a share in such writers as the poet Browning, whose Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came is instinct with hideous menace, or the novelist Joseph Conrad, who often wrote of the dark secrets within the sea and of the demoniac driving power of fate as influencing the lives of lonely and maniacally resolute. Its trails of one of infinite ramifications, but we must here confine ourselves to its appearance in a relatively unmixed state, where it determines and dominates the work of art containing it. Somewhat separate from the main British stream is that current of weirdness in Irish literature, which came to the fore in the Celtic Renaissance of the later 19th and early 20th centuries. Ghosts and fairy lore have always been of great prominence in Ireland, and for over 100 years have been recorded by a line of such faithful transcribers and translators as William Carleton, T. Crofton Crocker, Lady Wilde, mother of Oscar Wilde, Douglas Hyde, and W.B. Yeats. Brought to notice by the modern movement, this body of myths has been carefully collected and studied, and its salient features reproduced in the work of later figures like Yeats, J.M. Syne, A.E., Lady Gregory, Padraig Colm, James Stephens, and their colleagues. Whilst on the whole more whimsically fantastic than terrible, such folklore and its consciously artistic counterparts contain much that falls truly within the domain of cosmic horror. Tales of burials in sunken churches beneath haunted lakes, accounts of death heralding banshees and sinister changelings, ballads of specters and the unholy creature of the raths. All these have their poignant and definite shivers, and mark a strong and distinctive element in weird literature. Despite homely grotesqueness and absolute naivete, there is a genuine nightmare in the class of narrative represented by the yarn of Ty Gokane, who, in punishment for his wild life, was ridden all night by a hideous corpse that demanded burial and drove him from churchyard to churchyard as the dead rose up loathsomely in each one and refused to accommodate the newcomer with a berth. Yeats, undoubtedly the greatest figure of the Irish revival, is not the greatest of all living poets, if not the greatest of all living poets, has accomplished notable things, both in original work and the codification of old legends. All right, we will end that here tonight, and we will then finish this series tomorrow night. So this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly Podcast, signing off.